January 14th, 2026. Minus 19 degrees. And by the time the school bus vanished into the white above Frost Line, Montana, the mountain had already decided who it wanted to keep. What would you do if the whole town laughed at the only shelter that could save their children, and the first soul to understand that truth was not a man at all, but a white German shepherd digging at a patch of frozen ground nobody believed in? Caleb Reese had already lost the one person he could not survive losing, then survived it anyway, which is sometimes a slower kind of death. Now, as the wind came down the ridge like sharpened glass and the roads disappeared under a fresh wall of snow, his dog Ghost stopped listening to the sirens, stopped listening to the shouting, and drove both front paws into the drift beside a broken storm shelter everyone in Frost Line called a joke. There were 17 children missing on the upper road. The bus radio had gone dead. The town was running out of time. And while everyone else looked toward the mountain, the dog kept digging toward the dark. The question was no longer whether the storm would kill someone. The question was why Ghost was acting like something under the snow was still alive. Caleb Reese had learned a long time ago that there were two kinds of cold in the world. There was the kind that bit your cheeks, stiffened your fingers, and turned your breath into smoke. Then there was the kind that moved into your life after loss and stayed there, rearranging everything until even warm rooms felt like weather. He had known the first kind in mountain deployments, in desert nights that turned sharp before dawn, in survival training designed to teach men how little comfort their bodies truly required. He had known the second kind since the winter his wife Hannah died on a county road 2 miles outside Frost Line while trying to drive home ahead of a storm that people said would not be that bad. People in small mountain towns always said that at first. Storms were gossip until they turned personal. Caleb had been in North Carolina then, finishing out the last ugly weeks of a career that had taken too much and given back too little, standing on a training range with a retired body and a mind that still jumped at rotor sounds when the call came through. By the time he reached Montana, the road had been cleared, the car had been towed, the funeral meal had been eaten, and his daughter had already learned the look adults wear when they are waiting for you to collapse so they can call it natural. He never gave them that collapse. That was the problem. Towns like Frost Line did not know what to do with a grieving man who stayed standing. So they made him strange. They made him distant. They made him the veteran with the hard jaw and the white dog and the broken old shelter outside town that he kept repairing every winter as if nails and plywood could settle some private argument with God. The shelter sat on a sloped patch of inherited land just below the Ridge Cemetery, where the wind struck first and hardest. Once, long before Caleb came back for good, it had been part of a civil defense plan connected to the old timber money that used to pass through Frost Line. Then budgets died, maps disappeared, and the town decided it was easier to pretend the place had never mattered. By the time Caleb took it over, all that remained was a cracked concrete shell, a warped steel hatch, a half-buried intake pipe, and enough local mockery to last 3 winters. Grant Holloway had supplied most of that mockery himself. Grant was the kind of man every struggling town eventually produced and then mistook for leadership. Broad-shouldered, polished, sure of his own voice, expensive coat zipped to the chin, boots too clean for any weather that involved real work. He owned the lumber yard, chaired the council, and had spent the last 5 years smiling while making sure every useful thing in Frost Line passed through his hands first. He called Caleb's shelter a bunker for a dead man. He called it a snow coffin. Once, in front of 3 workers and a mother carrying groceries, he called it grief with a roof leak. Caleb had let that one pass because he had learned from war that not every insult deserved a response, and from widowhood that most people reached for cruelty only when they could feel your pain was larger than anything in their own lives. That afternoon, with the storm warnings upgraded twice and the sky already turning the color of hammered steel, Caleb had been on the shelter roof tightening down a sheet of corrugated metal over the weakest corner seam when Grant's truck rolled up in a spray of powder and slush. Ghost had seen it first. The white German shepherd, thick winter coat bright against the dark pine line, had lifted his head from the half-cleared intake trench and gone still in the way he only did when his attention sharpened into certainty. Then Grant stepped out laughing with 2 men from the yard, and the dog relaxed just enough to tell Caleb the danger was human, not hidden. "You patching that ruin again?" Grant had called, voice carrying in the cold. "Storm's not going to spare you because you built yourself a little fantasy." Caleb stayed on the ladder another second, driving one last screw through the metal sheet before looking down. Ghost moved to the base of the ladder and sat, not growling, not posturing, just watching Grant with those amber eyes that made liars uncomfortable. "Not a fantasy," Caleb said. "A shelter." The workers laughed because Grant did, and because men paid by another man's approval always laughed half a beat too fast. "That thing caves if somebody sneezes on it," Grant said. "You should come down to town hall instead of playing mountain prepper. We've got actual contingency planning." Caleb looked past him toward the valley where Frostline lay in a shallow spread of dark roofs and thin smoke plumes below the pines. Actual contingency planning in that town usually meant one backup generator, 3 bad decisions, and public confidence held together by coffee and denial. "If you're really prepared," Caleb said, "why are the school buses still on the upper road?" That hit something. Not enough to break Grant's smile, but enough to stiffen it. "Road crews watching conditions. Watching won't matter when the switchback disappears." One worker looked toward the ridge automatically. Everyone who lived long enough in Frostline knew the upper road's bad moods. The problem was that knowing and respecting were not always the same thing. Grant shrugged. "The storm won't come in hard till after dark." Caleb did not answer. He had spent too many winters and too many operations trusting his body when the air changed like this. The mountain was already loading snow. The pines were taking the wind wrong. There was a pressure to the silence between gusts that meant the weather was no longer deciding whether it would turn bad. It had already decided. Ghost rose, crossed the yard, and began pawing at the drift packed around the side vent pipe, the old secondary intake Caleb had only just rediscovered under 3 feet of ice 2 days earlier. He had been clearing it in spare hours because the dog had kept returning to that exact spot for a week, sniffing, circling, pawing once, then looking at Caleb with an insistence too deliberate to ignore. The first winter back home, Caleb would have dismissed behavior like that as routine canine fixation. But Ghost had not been raised for routine. The shepherd had served as a search and detection dog during Caleb's last deployment. White coat turned ghost gray by dust, nose so precise he once found a little Afghan girl alive under a collapsed mud wall after 2 engineers declared the site empty. He had detected hidden compartments in trucks, sent trails over shale, living breath behind concrete. More than that, he had understood Caleb in the half-silent way working dogs sometimes understand damaged men, not by words, but by the shape of their tension. Ghost had slept outside Hannah's old bedroom the first month after her funeral. He had dragged Caleb back from the frozen pond one night when grief and whiskey had almost convinced him the black ice would feel like quiet. He had become, without ceremony, the one witness in Caleb's life that never asked him to explain himself. So when Ghost became obsessed with the shelter's buried side vent, Caleb did what had kept him alive more than once. He listened. Grant must have noticed the attention shift because he smirked toward the dog. "Even your mutt knows it's a hole." Caleb climbed down from the ladder, each rung creaking under his boots. "He knows more than most people around here." That ended the laughter for a second, and in that second the first gust hit hard enough to rock the truck on its springs. Grant looked up at the sky again, then back toward town, and for just an instant Caleb saw something under the polished ease. Not fear exactly. Calculation. The kind men wore when they realized they might have underestimated the timing of a problem. He covered it quickly. "You planning to invite the whole town into that wreck when the snow starts? If they need it. And if it falls in?" Caleb rested one hand on Ghost's back. "Then at least somebody was trying." Grant said nothing to that. He just climbed back into the truck and rolled downhill toward Frostline with his workers, leaving tire tracks that the wind began erasing almost before the taillights vanished around the bend. An hour later, the first call came through town that the elementary school bus had been delayed on the return from the Ridge Museum. Half an hour after that, the radio contact became patchy. Another 20 minutes, and patchy turned into silence. By then the blizzard had stopped pretending to approach and started arriving in sheets, cutting sideways over the upper road, burying fence posts, wiping the church cross off the sky. Caleb was in the shelter's lower chamber checking the old space heater line when he heard the siren from Frost's line, one long rising cry that the wind tried to tear apart. Ghost was already at the door before the second note sounded. The dog did not bark. He just stood there in his black tactical K9 jacket, body angled toward the town, ears up, waiting to see if Caleb would catch up to the urgency in the air. He did. Within minutes, the road down to Frost's line had become a white corridor bordered by fences he could no longer see. Snow struck his face like shot. Ghost ran low and fast beside the truck, refusing the cab, as he always did when the work had turned real. By the time Caleb reached the square, the place had become pure winter panic. Men with shovels shouted over one another. Mothers in boots and blankets stood beneath the church steps with the brittle stillness of people trying not to imagine their children freezing in a ravine. Mara Vale, schoolteacher, volunteer EMT, and the one woman in town who had stopped flinching when she saw Caleb after enough summers of mudslide drills and bad winter accidents, was moving from person to person with a trauma bag over one shoulder and windburn already bright across her cheeks. "Upper bus is missing," she shouted when she saw him. 17 kids, driver, no contact for 20 minutes. Last position? Museum switchback. Maybe lower. Road crew? Stalled at the second bend. Ghost cut across the square then, ignoring the crowd completely, and ran not toward the upper road where every human eye was fixed, but back toward Caleb's shelter line above town. He stopped once at the edge of the square, looked over his shoulder, barked once, and ran on. Mara saw it. "Why is he going there?" Caleb was already moving. "Because he smells something we don't. The bus isn't there." "Then maybe the answer is." He started for the truck, but half the town was suddenly in front of him, asking questions, offering useless guesses, blocking motion with fear. Grant Holloway stepped out of the church hall just then, face red from heat and authority. And when he saw Ghost racing uphill through the snow, he actually laughed. "Of course," he shouted. "The dog wants the bunker." Caleb stopped so sharply snow sprayed around his boots. "It's a shelter." Grant spread his hands to the crowd like the whole thing were a stage, and he had the right to control its tone. "Your broken storm shelter is not where 17 children went, Caleb." The words had barely left his mouth when Ghost reached the ridge line above the square, vanished into blowing white, and began barking in a way that changed every face below. Not warning. Not confusion. Urgency. Repetition. Targeted. Caleb knew that bark. He had heard it in rubble fields, dry riverbeds, and bombed compounds. Find. Here. Now. He looked at Grant once, then at Mara, then at the mothers gathered under the church awning, and everything in him settled into that narrow cold clarity he used to enter before breaching a door. "Either I'm wrong," he said, voice flat enough to cut through the square, "or your children are alive because the thing you laughed at is the only place this mountain let them reach." Then he turned and ran into the blizzard toward the ruined shelter, with the whole town's fear rising behind him like another storm. By the time Caleb reached the shelter ridge, the wind had turned so hard it no longer felt like something moving through the town, but something trying to push it off the map entirely. Snow came in long white sheets that erased the truck tracks behind him as quickly as they formed, and the old shelter stood where it always stood, half sunken, patched with metal and weathered timber, mocked by everyone in Frost's line who had never once spent a night truly afraid of freezing to death. Ghost was at the side wall, not the front hatch, not the broken main door, but the half-buried secondary intake trench Caleb had spent 3 separate afternoons clearing because the dog kept returning to it with that same obsessive precision. The white German shepherd had both front paws buried in the drift, snow exploding behind him as he dug into the packed side bank with such force that his black tactical K9 jacket flashed in and out of the storm like a moving signal. Caleb dropped beside him and immediately felt it, warm air, faint but real, breathing through the snow beneath the vent pipe. Not much. Not enough to heat a room by itself. But enough to tell a man the chamber below was still alive. Ghost barked once into the drift, then shoved his muzzle deeper into the gap and whined hard, the sound pitched low with urgency. Caleb scraped away snow with both arms and uncovered the curved mouth of the old intake, half crushed, iron collar bent but not fully sealed. The storm screamed over them, but beneath that roar he heard something else. A dull impact from inside. Then another. Not random movement. Not shifting debris. Knocking. Human. They're here. He breathed, not to Ghost, not to himself, but to the mountain, as if naming it would keep panic from getting there first. He rose and turned back toward the town. Through the white he could already see them coming, silhouettes fighting their way uphill, flashlights stabbing uselessly through the blizzard, voices broken apart by wind. Mara was first among them. Grant came too, slower, angrier, flanked by 2 of his yard men and the deputy with a pry bar over one shoulder. Behind them came 3 mothers who should never have been allowed out in weather like this but would have fought God himself before staying behind if there was even the smallest chance their children were under that snow. Ghost backed from the intake long enough to look directly at Caleb, snow frosting his lashes, chest heaving, and then attacked the same spot again as if afraid the humans were still too slow to understand. Caleb met Mara halfway between the vent and the front hatch. "They made it!" he shouted. "Lower chamber." Her whole face changed in an instant, terror and hope colliding so hard it made her look younger and older at the same time. "How many?" "Don't know yet." "Can you get in?" "Not through the main door." Grant reached them then, bent against the wind, one glove pressed to his hat. "This is insane," he snapped. "You don't know if the chamber's stable." Caleb rounded on him with a stillness more dangerous than shouting. "I know there are children under my shelter. That thing hasn't been inspected in 20 years. And your school bus route vanished 30 minutes ago." Mara stepped between them before the argument could waste another second. "Stop. If they're alive, we move now." The deputy crouched at the intake and listened, then looked up pale. "I hear voices." "That did it." The mother surged forward, one crying out a name into the vent mouth, another dropping to her knees in the snow. The third just stood there with both hands over her mouth and no sound at all, which was somehow harder to look at. Caleb pushed everyone back from the intake. "Nobody crowds the wall. If this side gives way, you bury the air." He had to say it twice before the meaning cut through fear. Ghost stood over the opening like he meant to guard it with his body if he had to. Caleb moved to the front hatch, kicked snow off the warped steel seam, and jammed the pry bar under the lip. The main hatch had been damaged for years. That was why the town mocked the shelter. The upper door sat crooked on its frame, the hinged bolts on one side bent from a long-ago roof slip, and every winter Caleb patched around the weakness instead of pretending it didn't exist. People thought that made him foolish. In truth, it was the reason the lower chamber still worked. He knew every flaw in that structure because he had rebuilt it with his hands after Hannah died, one salvaged panel and poured bucket of concrete at a time. He knew where the old civil defense walls were sound and where the post-mine shortcuts had been made. He knew the lower chamber held better than the upper shell. He knew the side intake fed the backup heat line because Ghost had found the original pipe map buried in the tool cabinet only 3 days earlier when the dog had knocked the loose board free. Most of all, he knew the storm had not driven 17 children to this exact ridge by accident. It had cornered them here because this was the one structure close enough, visible enough, and sheltered enough to reach when the road became white death. He drove the pry bar again. The hatch groaned but did not open. "Chains!" he shouted. The deputy and one of Grant's yard men brought them fast. Together they looped the links through the ring bolts Caleb had welded onto the hatch 2 winters earlier, back when the whole town said he was overbuilding for a fantasy emergency. "Truck," he said. Grant hesitated. It was only half a second, but Caleb saw it. The man still feared opening the place more than he feared standing there useless while children froze 10 feet below. Mara saw it too. "Move," she said, and the voice she used could have cut sheet metal. Grant finally signaled one of the workers toward the truck. They anchored the chain to the tow hook. Caleb looked once at the shelter roof and did fast mental math he had not had to do in years. If the hatch tore wrong, the upper shell might shift. If the shell shifted, the lower chamber could load on one side. If the lower chamber loaded, the intake could block. "Everybody off the wall line!" he shouted. "Now!" Ghost obeyed first, jumping clear of the intake trench and backing to Caleb's leg, body quivering with the effort not to run back to the voices. The truck pulled. The chain snapped tight with a metallic crack. The hatch shrieked against its frame but held. Snow blew through the square of silence right after, the kind that comes when everybody around a danger finally understands it is real. "Again!" Caleb yelled. The driver pulled harder. This time the warped edge lifted half an inch. Warm air burst from the seam. A child screamed from below, not in new fear, but because hope had reached them, and children do not know how to hide that sound. One of the mothers dropped to her knees right there in the drift, and started sobbing. Caleb shoved the pry bar into the gap and put everything he had left in his shoulders and spine into levering the hatch upward while the chain kept tension. Old scar tissue burned under his jacket. Metal protested. The storm kept hammering. Ghost barked 3 times straight into the opening as the hatch finally lurched high enough to expose the dark drop below. A square shaft. Rusted ladder rungs bolted into poured concrete. Emergency light glowing from deeper down. And then faces. 2 children first, looking up through the shadow with white fear on them, then more shapes crowding behind, packed close together in winter coats, and school colors and dust. 17. Caleb counted instinctively because SEAL training never left the mind when bodies were at risk. 17 children. 1 bus driver slumped against the back wall. 1 older student, maybe 14, standing in front of the others with both hands spread as if she had been trying to be taller than she was for a long time. Heat still rose from below, weak but steady. They had found the lower chamber. They had survived the first kill window of the storm. But the upper shelter shell gave a long low groan above them that told Caleb everything else they needed to know. This was no rescue completed. This was a rescue beginning under a structure already deciding whether it wanted to stay standing. "Listen to me!" he shouted down the shaft, and every child went still because the tone of a man who expects to be obeyed can still overpower panic when it arrives at the right second. "You stay exactly where you are. Nobody pushes the ladder. Nobody climbs until I say. You understand?" A ragged chorus answered from below. The older girl nodded once, hard, jaw shaking. Mara was beside him now, kneeling at the hatch, voice immediately softer than his but no less commanding. "If anyone is hurt badly, tell me now." The older girl looked down, then up. Mr. Talbot hit his head. He got us inside. The bus driver. Caleb took that in, then asked the next thing that mattered. "How did you get in?" The girl's eyes moved toward Ghost. "The dog," she said. "He was here. He kept barking at the side wall. There was a broken vent. We crawled through." Behind Mara, even Grant went silent at that. Caleb looked at Ghost. The dog stood with snow on his muzzle and ice on his whiskers, ears high, not proud, not excited, just ready for the next task because that was who he was. It landed hard on everyone at once. The town had laughed at the shelter, and the only one who understood it in time had been the animal they called just a dog. A cracking noise ran across the roof seam. Snow sloughed off the back edge. Caleb's head snapped upward. Too much loading. Too much drift weight across the weakened beam over the main hatch. "We can't use this as the exit," he said. Mara followed his gaze and understood instantly. "The roof? If 17 kids hit that ladder one after another, we shock the frame. It comes in." Grant found his voice at exactly the wrong moment. "Then we wait for the state rescue team." Caleb stared at him in disbelief that curdled almost immediately into contempt. "In this? What do you propose?" Ghost answered before Caleb did. The shepherd broke from his side, ran around the shelter wall, and began barking at the old furnace slab near the north corner where half the concrete was hidden under drift and old lumber. Not random. Not panic. Same exact bark pattern. Same exact fixed point insistence. The dog had another answer. Caleb ran to him, dropped into the snow, and brushed away the top layer with both hands. Under the drift lay a rusted steel plate Caleb had never fully uncovered because it had been welded under an old oil furnace base before he inherited the place. He had always assumed it was dead weight from some earlier system. Ghost hammered both paws against it and barked directly at Caleb's face. Mara reached them seconds later. "What is it?" Caleb stared at the plate, then back toward the hatch where 17 trapped children waited under a failing roof, then at the old shelter plans half-remembered from months of lonely repairs and one half-burned civil defense map he had found in a county auction box years ago. His pulse changed. "Not a furnace base," he said slowly. "A secondary access cap?" Mara's eyes widened. "Internal shaft?" "Maybe." Grant shouted from the hatch that the roof was shifting again. The mothers were crying openly now. The deputy was already moving toward them with a shovel. Caleb grabbed the pry bar from the drift, drove it under the steel plate's edge, and felt the whole buried slab answer with a hollow iron boom from beneath. Ghost exploded into barking. Mara looked down into the seam as warm air leaked up through the snow. "Caleb!" He shoved harder, every muscle in his body locking. The plate moved half an inch. Under the storm, under the broken shelter, under the town's laughter, another way in was waiting. The steel plate did not open like a forgotten thing. It opened like something that had been waiting all along for the right hands to remember it was there. The pry bar screamed against the frozen seam, Ghost barked so hard his whole chest shook, and Caleb drove his shoulder into the edge of the slab until old rust gave way in a shower of ice and dirt. The plate lifted barely enough at first to let a ribbon of stale warm air pour out, then more as the deputy jammed a shovel blade into the gap and helped lever it higher. Beneath the furnace slab was a narrow vertical shaft lined with old steel rungs and lit from below by weak yellow emergency strips that should have been dead 20 years earlier. Caleb looked at Mara and did not need to say what both of them already knew. The shelter had a second internal route exactly where Ghost had been trying to tell him it was. Above them, the roof groaned again under loading snow. At the main hatch, the children's voices rose in frightened confusion because they could hear adults moving somewhere they could not see. And down inside the new shaft, the same older girl who had spoken before suddenly appeared in the dim light below, looking up through the dust and warm shadow like somebody staring at a doorway in a dream. "Can you see us?" Mara shouted. The girl nodded fast. "There's stairs. They're blocked, but I think they go up." That was enough. Caleb turned instantly to the crowd gathering at the shelter edge. "No one touches the main ladder unless I say. We use the internal shaft." Grant opened his mouth to object again, but Mara cut him off with a look so cold it made the wind seem merciful. "You want to help?" she said. "Start shoveling the north wall before the drift crushes the side vent." Even he obeyed that one, because sometimes authority changes hands not through law but through competence witnessed under pressure. Caleb dropped into the shaft feet first, boots hitting the rungs with metallic clanks swallowed quickly by the shelter's belly. Ghost followed him without hesitation, white body disappearing into the narrow drop as if he had done it 100 times before. Mara came next, then the deputy, while above them the mothers stayed at the hatch with the workers and Jeb Mercer organized shovels, ropes, and heat blankets in the storm. The lower shaft opened into a short, slanted corridor choked with drifted dust, a cracked handrail, and the smell of old insulation. It joined the main chamber through a block stairwell half buried behind a collapsed wall panel. The children were on the other side, pressed together under emergency blankets and bus jackets, faces pale and eyes too wide, the kind of silence on them that only comes after fear has lasted long enough to become discipline. The bus driver, Mr. Talbot, sat propped against the far wall with one side of his face caked in dried blood, barely conscious but breathing. The older students stood in front of the smaller ones exactly where Caleb had seen her from above, one hand braced on the wall, refusing to let herself shake until someone older arrived to inherit the terror from her. Ghost crossed the chamber first, moving child to child, checking them in the fast, precise way trained dogs do when they know the living matter more than the drama. One of the youngest girls burst into tears the second the shepherd reached her and wrapped both arms around his neck. Ghost stayed still for her exactly 3 seconds, then moved on, because comfort was not the mission yet. Survival was. Caleb knelt by Talbot and checked pupils, pulse, breathing. Concussion, maybe cracked ribs, borderline hypothermia, but alive and not actively crashing. Mara was already working down the line of children, asking names, checking fingers and ears, making them answer simple questions so she could hear who was slipping and who was holding. "How long have you been in here?" Caleb asked the older girl. 40 minutes? Maybe an hour. I don't know. Her voice was dry and trying too hard to sound adult. Bus slid off the switchback. Mr. Talbot told us to run for the only building we could see. We thought it was empty. She looked toward Ghost. Then the dog came. Caleb followed her gaze. The shepherd had reached the side vent breach, the one the children had crawled through, and was now barking once into the opening as if confirming the route was still there. "He found you," Caleb said. The girl shook her head. "No. He found the shelter first. We followed him." That landed in the room like another kind of silence. Children had survived a blizzard because the town mocked the one man who knew enough to repair the place, and because that man's dog had sensed the old airflow and led them to it before the mountain finished closing its hand. Caleb stood and looked around the chamber properly for the first time. It was bigger than he expected, lower than standard height, built in the brutal practical style of old civil defense projects. Thick concrete, reinforced corners, bolted cots, storage shelves, emergency heater drums still ticking weak warmth into the room through an ancient duct network. Half the main ceiling above the front hatch line had taken load, which explained the groaning shell outside. Another section near the stairwell had shed concrete and timber, blocking part of the upper route but not all of it. If they tried to move 17 children up the main hatch ladder under the shifting roof, the vibration alone could bring the compromise beam down. If they left them where they were, the side vent could drift shut and the heater might fail before state rescue ever reached Frost's line. The answer had to be inside the structure. Ghost knew that before any of them did. The white shepherd trotted away from the vent and stopped near the chamber's far corner where an old cast-iron furnace body sat bolted to a raised slab. He barked at the floor twice, then pawed the concrete edge hard enough to knock loose a strip of ice-coated dust. Caleb crossed to him. The furnace assembly had never made sense in the shelter. Too small for the space. Too low for a proper vent stack. Decorative almost, except nobody decorates civil defense architecture. He brushed away debris and found a seam. "It's another cover," he said. Mara looked up from a child with blue fingers. "You mean another shaft? Maybe the original one." The older student stepped closer. "There's a draft under it. We felt it." Caleb drove the pry bar into the seam. The slab shifted slightly. Not welded. Just frozen by years of neglect. He pulled again, harder this time, and with the deputy bracing the opposite side, the whole furnace cap lifted enough to reveal a narrow iron-lined shaft dropping into darkness, and then curving upward with ancient switchback steps. Not blocked completely. Not dead. Hidden. Ghost let out one sharp triumphant bark and immediately began down climbing the top 3 steps as if to prove the path held. Caleb shone his flashlight in. The stair spiraled up behind the north wall and, judging by the angle, likely exited into the upper shell near the old storage bay, not the damaged hatch line. If it was clear enough, they could move the children in controlled groups without stressing the weakest roof section. If. That one word sat like a knife in every rescue plan he had ever made. Mara read his face. "How bad?" "Unknown until I go up. Then I go behind you." He looked at her. There was blood on one glove, powder on her coat, and the same fury he had seen in her at the school when a drunk father once tried to take an injured child out of triage. "You stay with them," he said. "If the stair holds, I call you. If it doesn't, you keep the chamber calm and use the vent route for the smallest first." She hated that because it made sense. "Fine," she said tightly. But if you don't answer in 2 minutes, I'm coming anyway. That, too, made sense. Caleb squeezed the older girl's shoulder once. You did good. She nearly broke then, just from someone older saying the thing out loud, but she swallowed it, and nodded because she had 17 smaller souls watching her like gravity. Ghost looked back from the stair and waited. Caleb followed him into the shaft. The steps were narrow, iron-edged, and steep enough to punish any hesitation. Dust rose under his boots. Old webs clung to the corners. Twice the stair vibrated with the storm's pressure on the outer wall, reminding him that the whole structure remained in negotiation with the mountain. Ghost climbed fast but not recklessly, testing each landing before moving on, the black K9 jacket disappearing and reappearing through the dust like a signal flag in low light. 20 feet up, the shaft ended at a steel hatch jammed under a pile of warped shelves and broken timber. Caleb shoved at it. It moved an inch, then stopped. He shoved harder. Something above shifted. Snow spilled through a crack. Then light. Natural storm light. The old storage bay above the chamber. Not fully collapsed. Usable. He got his shoulder under the hatch and heaved until the opening widened enough to climb through. The bay beyond was cold and half buried but structurally separate from the main hatch beam line. This would work. It had to. He dropped to one knee and shouted down that the stair was good. From below came the sound of relief breaking open in 17 smaller bodies at once. Then the shelter gave another long groan, deeper than before, and one of the storage bay support braces above Caleb's head shifted visibly under the load. The window for moving those children had just become much smaller. Below him, Ghost barked twice, urgent again. Not because he doubted the way out. Because something else in the shelter had started to fail first. The sound of a shelter beginning to lose an argument with the mountain is different from the sound of a storm itself. Wind rages outside. Snow hammers roofs. That is weather. Structural failure is more intimate. It groans. It shifts in the walls like something old waking up angry. Caleb had heard that sound before in blown compounds, collapsed mud homes, and one schoolhouse overseas where the floor gave way 3 minutes after he pulled the last child out. He knew what it meant now when the north storage bay brace twitched under the load and snow dust filtered through the seam overhead. The upper shell was still standing, but only because the mountain had not yet decided exactly where to put its full weight. Below him, 17 children and one injured driver waited in the lower chamber with the faith only frightened people have, the kind that does not ask whether rescue is elegant or safe, only whether it is still coming. Ghost barked again from the stairwell, not at Caleb this time, but toward the far side of the storage bay where the old vent manifold ran under a rusted workbench and disappeared through the north wall. Caleb dropped from the hatch opening and crossed to it immediately. Warm air. Fading. The backup heat line that had kept the lower chamber survivable was weakening. He crouched and shoved aside broken crates until he found the source, an old damper wheel half frozen open, vibrating under the pressure imbalance caused by the upper hatch breach and the damaged roof line. If that line iced over or lost draw completely, the lower room would go from cold to lethal in less than half an hour. The storm was not only loading the roof. It was taking their heat away one mechanical failure at a time. Caleb keyed his radio, but static answered. The steel and concrete swallowed signal. So he did the next thing. He shouted down the stairwell. Mara! We move now. Oldest first to help the little ones on the steps. Nobody carries 2 bags. Nobody turns back. Her answer came up fast, already in motion. What about Talbot? Last or second to last, depending on the roof. He looked once more at the brace above him and decided not to say aloud what he was thinking. Depending on whether the roof gave them the kindness of sequence. The first child came up 30 seconds later, a boy with snow-burned cheeks and the blank stunned eyes of someone who had been good for too long under fear. Caleb caught him under the arm, turned him toward the cleared bay opening, and pointed. See the rope line? Follow it outside to Jeb. Don't let go. The boy nodded and moved. The second child hesitated at the top stair until Ghost appeared behind her, pressed one white shoulder gently against her leg, and guided her forward. That was enough. Within a minute the stair had become a living chain of small boots, shaking mittens, winter coats dusted white from the shelter walls, and ghosts moving up and down the line like a pulse, sometimes above, sometimes below, always where panic needed him most. Mara came up after the fourth child to help Caleb receive them. Her cheeks were raw from cold and stress, her beanie half torn loose, but her hands were steady. "Two are starting to crash," she said low. "The smallest boy and one girl near the back. Talbot's fading. Can he climb?" "Not alone. Then he goes before the final group." She nodded once and turned instantly to the next child, wiping blood and grime from a little face with the edge of her sleeve before sending the girl toward daylight. Outside, through the north bay opening, Caleb could hear the storm and human voices fighting each other for dominance. Jeb was there somewhere, shouting counts. The deputy was running shuttle between the church wall and the shelter line. Grant's workers were on the rope line too now, not because they had become brave, but because there comes a point in every public disaster when men either become useful or never recover their own names. Caleb did not care which one drove them. He cared only that they held the line steady as the children emerged one by one into the blizzard and disappeared toward warmth. 5 up. 7. 9. The pace was good until the shelter gave another full-body groan and the stair under Ghost's paws jumped half an inch sideways with a metallic crack. Every child in the shaft froze. Mara looked up. Caleb looked at the brace. Snow poured through the roof seam now in a steady hiss. "Move!" he barked, and because his voice carried the exact shape of emergency, the spell broke. The line moved again. Ghost doubled back down the steps and came up beside the smallest boy, almost carrying the child with his body on the inside rail. Caleb felt something in his chest tighten unexpectedly at the sight. Not fear. Recognition. This was what Ghost had always done. Not simply obey, not simply detect, but distribute calm. In Afghanistan, scared young soldiers had steadied when the dog lay beside them before insertion. At Hannah's funeral, Emma had rested one shaking hand on Ghost's back instead of collapsing in front of strangers. Some creatures did not know they were bridging people back toward courage. They just did it. The 10th child reached the bay and then the whole shelter lurched. Not a groan this time. A real movement. Somewhere in the main hatch section, a beam failed with a crack like a rifle shot. The upper shell boomed. Snow avalanched off the front half of the roof. One of the children screamed. Caleb shoved the boy nearest him toward Mara, then braced instinctively under the nearest support, as if his body could argue with a mountain. Dust and splinters filled the bay. Ghost barked from the stair. Then silence. The kind that is always worse. "Ghost!" Caleb shouted. A beat later, the dog answered from below. Alive. And from farther down came crying. Too much crying. The line had broken. Mara looked at him once, no words, both of them understanding the same thing at the same terrible time. The partial roof failure at the front hatch had sent a shock through the stairwell. Somewhere below, the children had bunched. If panic locked that stair, the ones still in the chamber could die in order rather than all at once. Caleb went down. There was no discussion because some movements happened before thought. He hit the turn landing 3 steps at a time until he reached the jam point. 2 children clung to the inside rail crying into each other's coats. One older girl trying and failing to move a frozen younger child whose bootlace had snagged on a bent stair edge. Behind them, the chamber below had gone from disciplined fear to contagious fear in under 10 seconds. He could hear it spreading. Ghost was there, white body planted sideways across the stair, preventing the children behind from surging upward and crushing the ones in front. The dog's chest was against the crying younger child, holding her in place without force, keeping the stair from becoming a human knot. Caleb dropped to one knee, cut the lace with his knife, and lifted the girl bodily. "Look at me," he said to the older one. "You breathe with me right now." She tried. Failed. Tried again. That was enough. He shoved both girls upward into Mara's reach and shouted down the stairwell that everyone below was to sit against the wall, and keep hands visible. The command cut through because fear listens when someone sounds more certain than the disaster. The crying softened. Ghost looked up at him once, then back down toward the chamber, as if asking what next. Caleb pointed up. Take the line. The shepherd moved immediately, trotting past him and pressing through the children with that intense controlled urgency that always made people obey without knowing why. From above, Mara's voice came down the shaft. 12 out. Caleb counted the chamber below. 5 children left. Talbot, the older student. 7 total. He went down into the room again. The older student was still trying to act like fear had no teeth, arms spread protectively in front of the smallest girl and a boy with blood dried under one nostril. Talbot was worse now, head lolling, breath shallow. Caleb crouched in front of the girl. What's your name? Sadie. Sadie, I need your help. Her mouth trembled. Okay. You take the next 2 up. You keep them moving even if they cry. You understand? She nodded once, because responsibility can look a lot like courage in the right child. Mara reached the chamber then, dropped beside Talbot, checked him once, and looked up with the answer already on her face. He goes now. Caleb got an arm under the bus driver's shoulder. Talbot came partly awake with a groan. Kids? He whispered. Alive, Caleb said. That's all you need. Together they got him onto the stair. He could climb 2 steps under his own weight, then sagged. Caleb took most of it. Mara pushed from below. Ghost worked ahead, turning every landing into a checkpoint, making room with movement and body language in ways no human could have managed in that narrow choke point. Above them the North Bay was now their whole world. The front half of the shelter had effectively failed. Every new sound from that direction came filtered and wrong, which meant open collapse or near enough to it. Talbot made it to the top. Jeb's voice from outside called that 13 children were clear. Caleb went down again. The chamber now held only Sadie, 3 smaller children, and the heater drum ticking weaker with every minute. The girl looked at him and the question in her eyes was too old for her face. Is it going to fall? Not before we leave. He lied. Good rescuers lie carefully. This was one of those times. He got the smallest girl on one hip, pointed the other 2 to the rail, and started them upward. Mara took rear position this time. Halfway up, the heater line died with a thin metallic sigh. The lower chamber dimmed. Cold entered differently when heat left. Not as sensation. As verdict. Ghost stopped dead at the top landing, then spun and ran back down past them, not panicked, not confused, but driven. Caleb's heart hit hard once because the dog did not abandon an extraction unless he sensed someone was still missing. He counted again while climbing. 1, 2, 3 children. Mara. Talbot was out. Sadie behind him. He reached the bay, shoved the children toward the rope line, and looked down just in time to see Ghost vanish back into the chamber he had just cleared. Then he heard it. A weak knocking. Not from the stair. From behind the old furnace slab in the lower room. There had been another pocket all along, and the dog had found it before any of them had the right to call the rescue complete. The worst moments in rescue are not always the loud ones. Sometimes they come in the instant after relief, when your body has already started to believe the danger has narrowed, and then one new sound opens the whole night back up again. Caleb stood in the North Bay with cold air pouring through the storm-torn opening, 14 children now above ground or on their way there, Mara still in the stairwell, Talbot barely breathing under 2 workers' hands, and Ghost disappearing back into the lower chamber because he had heard something no one else had heard soon enough. That weak knocking from behind the furnace slab hit Caleb with almost physical force. Another pocket. Another trapped soul. Maybe more than one. He turned so fast the world blurred. Mara saw it at once in his face. What? Somebody else. She did not waste a second asking how he knew. If the dog had gone back, that was answer enough. Take the last 3 out, Caleb said. I'm checking the chamber. No, Mara, no! Her eyes were wild with exhaustion and fury, and the old grief she carried like a blade inside her coat. Every time you hear one more life, you go farther than the plan. That's how men die under roofs. That's also how they keep other people from dying under them. The argument was too familiar in its shape for two people who had never once called what lived between them friendship. It was the argument of those left on the edge of danger with men who had made a habit of entering it. Mara grabbed his sleeve hard. Then don't make me choose between the children on these stairs and you in that room. For 1 second, with the blizzard howling through the broken bay and the shelter groaning like an old ship, Caleb saw what the night had done to her too. She was not only trying to save 17 children. She was trying not to stand once again in a Montana winter and wait for a man she could not stop to vanish into the part of the story where people become memory. He softened his voice because there are moments when urgency and gentleness must live in the same sentence if it is going to land. You don't choose. You get them out. That's the job. Before she could answer, Ghost barked from below, one sharp command that carried more certainty than panic. Caleb broke free and went down. The lower chamber had changed in the short time they had been climbing. With the heater line dead, the warmth that had once held the room together was leaking away fast. The emergency lights still worked, but dimmer now, painting the walls in a tired yellow that made the concrete look sick. Snow dust sifted from the upper crack near the collapsed front line. The old furnace slab sat where it had been earlier, iron-capped and half-buried in grime, but now Ghost stood over it like a sentry and was scratching not at the top edge, but low near the base where a strip of paneling had sheared away. Caleb dropped beside him. "Show me." The dog whined once and shoved his muzzle at the gap. Caleb flattened himself to the floor, pressed his ear near the opening, and heard it clearly now, not random tapping, not settling debris, but weak fingers or metal striking from behind a narrow wall void. Human. Alive. He swept his flashlight over the slab housing and found what he had missed before under pressure, a secondary maintenance seam, a service panel built into the furnace base from the side rather than the top. Rusted shut. Packed with dust. Hidden because the whole shelter had been designed by men who expected only the right people to know where the true routes were. He drove the pry bar into the seam. The first strike slipped. The second bit. The panel shuddered and gave half an inch. Ghost backed just enough to avoid the metal edge, then barked directly into the opening. A child answered from behind it with the smallest sound Caleb had heard all night. Not a cry. Just a breath breaking under fear. "There's a kid in there," he shouted toward the stair. Mara was beside him seconds later with the older student, Sadie, right behind her because children do not stop being brave just because adults want them to. "Who's missing?" Caleb asked. Sadie's face went blank for a second as she counted under panic. "Wait." Her mouth opened. "Liam." The name hit the chamber like a dropped stone. "He sat in the back," she said, voice rising. "When the bus slid, I thought he was with the second group." He had not been. Somewhere in the chaos of the first crawl through the vent, the hidden chamber, the stair transfer, the loading roof, one small boy had ended up behind the furnace wall in a maintenance crawl no one had even known existed. Caleb did not let anger at himself in. Anger was a tax you paid later, if later came. He ripped the panel harder. The steel peeled away in a long scream of rust and strain until an opening appeared barely wider than a child's shoulders. Beyond it was a narrow pipe chase, no more than 3 feet deep, where a little boy in a blue school coat sat wedged between old insulated lines and the back wall, one arm trapped under a bent duct brace, face white with dust and terror. Ghost thrust his nose into the opening first, and the boy immediately tried to crawl toward him, only to cry out when the trapped arm held. "Easy," Caleb said, dropping all command from his voice. "You're okay. We've got you." The boy's lower lip shook. "I couldn't find the stairs. You found the dog. That's enough." Mara slid to the floor beside Caleb and shone her penlight through the gap. "Arm isn't crushed. Pinned at the elbow. We bend the brace up, we can pull him. If the wall holds." She looked at the furnace housing, at the failing chamber around them, then back at him. "If the wall holds." Ghost kept his muzzle against the boy's cheek until the child's breathing steadied enough for Caleb to work. The old duck brace was bolted into the crawl base with 2 rusted anchors. Caleb hit the first with the pry bar. It snapped. The second bent but held. Mara braced the panel edge with both hands while Caleb put everything left in his shoulders into levering the duct upward. The metal screamed. The boy cried out. Then the brace shifted just enough. "No," Mara said. Caleb reached in, got a grip under the child's jacket, and eased him forward inch by inch while Ghost backed carefully, maintaining contact the whole way as if the dog understood that the line between panic and obedience in a trapped child could be no more than the presence of warm fur and steady eyes. Liam came free with a sob so violent it seemed to tear the whole chamber open. Mara took him, checked the arm, and pressed him tight against her coat while Sadie covered her mouth and turned away to hide the look on her face. "Get him out," Caleb said. Mara did not move. "You too. I'm not leaving you here alone. The chamber's done." Another deep groan answered him from above, the kind with finality in it. The mountain had stopped negotiating. It was beginning to collect. He looked up at the front line of the room where the first collapse had occurred. Fine cracks had become visible across the remaining ceiling slab, dust pulsing through them in tiny bursts. "Mara!" She looked at the ceiling and knew. This time she did not argue. She shoved Liam towards Sadie. "Take him up! Do not stop on the stairs." Sadie nodded and moved. Ghost stayed planted. Mara grabbed Caleb's sleeve once more, but not to stop him. "You said there were 3 little ones left before. They're out?" "They're with Jeb." "Talbot?" "Out." Her eyes searched his face, counting what still remained to lose. "Then come." It should have been simple. He should have gone with her. He had the last child. The room was failing. The mission was done. But then Ghost turned away from them and trotted not toward the stair, but toward the collapsed front section where snow blew in through the broken hatch line. The dog froze there, ears high, body taut, one paw lifted. Caleb's stomach dropped. "No!" Mara heard it in his tone. "What?" He swept his light across the half-collapsed front section, and saw something he had missed under urgency earlier. Near the front beam pile, partly hidden under a torn blanket and a scatter of roof debris, lay a canvas duffel with the school district logo. One of the emergency winter kits the bus carried. Half buried beside it was a small hand, still moving weakly. Another child. Not from the group line. Hidden by debris. Ghost barked once, and the whole chamber shuddered so hard a chunk of concrete dropped from the upper wall. Mara actually swore, the sound raw and broken. "Caleb!" He was already moving. The buried child was wedged beneath a fallen section of shelving and splintered hatch frame. Smaller than the others. Kindergarten maybe. Eyes open but glassy, mouth moving without sound. "We don't have time," Mara said, and the cruelty of the sentence was what made it true. Caleb ignored it because some truths are real and still unacceptable. He dropped to his knees, shoved at the shelf, and felt at once how trapped it was under the beam. Too heavy to lift clean. Too unstable to cut around. Ghost scrambled onto the debris and began digging at the far side where snow and broken timber had packed together around the child's legs. Not random. Not frantic. The dog had found the release point. Caleb moved there instantly, shoving timber free by hand, tearing away soaked insulation, ripping splintered boards loose until the pressure on the shelf shifted. Mara saw it too and came in low from the other side, using her trauma shears as a wedge to cut snagged blanket and strap loops. The little boy blinked slowly at Ghost as if the dog were the last clear thing left in the world. "Stay with him," Caleb said to the shepherd, and Ghost did, pressing chest and shoulder against the child where he could. One more shift. One more pull. The shelf rose an inch. Enough. Mara dragged the boy free by both arms and rolled with him just as the front half of the chamber gave way. The sound was not one crash but several in immediate sequence: beam, concrete, hatch frame, roof slab, each one folding into the next until the whole front section of the room detonated inward in a white blast of snow, dust, and broken history. Caleb felt the air punch out of his lungs. Then Mara's hand found his coat. Ghost was barking somewhere very close, and the only thing that mattered in the world was the stair that still might get them out before the rest of the broken shelter followed the front half into the mountain. For a moment after the collapse, Caleb could not hear anything except the raw mechanical ringing inside his own skull. The front chamber had come down in a white-brown wall of snow, timber, and concrete dust that turned the room into blindness and impact. He hit the floor hard enough for old pain to light up in his shoulder, one knee skidding across grit, one hand still searching instinctively for purchase on a world that had shifted under him without permission. Somewhere very close, a child was coughing. Somewhere else, Ghost was barking in the short, furious bursts that meant movement, follow, here, now. Then Mara grabbed the back of his jacket and dragged him one hard foot sideways just before a second slab shattered onto the place where his head had been. Dust hit them like smoke. Cold blasted into the lower chamber through the new collapse void where the front half of the shelter had once stood, bringing with it the full savage voice of the blizzard. The room they had been working in was no longer a room. It was now a broken pocket of shelter and storm fighting over the same air. Caleb rolled to his knees and found the little boy first because Ghost had put his own body over him. The white German shepherd was crouched low across the child's chest and shoulders, tactical K9 jacket already powdered white again, head turned toward the collapse as if daring the mountain to try one more move. The child was crying now, which was good. Crying meant breath, and breath meant life. Mara had one hand under the boy's neck, the other shielding his face from falling grit. Her beanie was gone. Her hair had come loose in dusty dark strands across her cheeks, and there was blood at one temple that had not been there seconds earlier. "Can he move?" Caleb shouted, because volume was all the chamber understood now. Mara checked the boy with 3 fast practiced touches. "Leg bruised, maybe worse. But yes." The older student, Sadie, was halfway to the stair landing with Liam clinging to her coat and eyes huge with terror. She had not run. She had stopped. Waiting, even in that chaos, because some people become dependable before adulthood has the decency to ask whether they want that burden. "Go!" Mara screamed at her. "Go now!" That broke the spell. Sadie hauled Liam upward into the stairwell. Caleb got his arms under the newly found boy and rose, every muscle in his back protesting, while Ghost spun in place once, scanning the chamber the way he used to scan ruined compounds after secondary blasts. The dog's attention hit the left wall, then the ceiling seam, then the stair. Exit. Now. Another load-bearing crack rolled overhead like deep thunder. The lower chamber had minutes earlier. Now it had seconds. Caleb started for the stair with the child in his arms, Mara at his side, Ghost in front, all of them moving through a world of airborne dust and screaming wind. The staircase felt steeper coming up than it had going down, maybe because now every step carried the weight of what remained behind them. At the first landing, the left rail tore free under Mara's grip and fell backward into the dust. She caught herself with the wall and kept moving without even looking down. Caleb reached the turn with the boy and nearly lost footing when packed snow from the collapse above poured down the stairwell like sand. Ghost leaped back, planted himself below Caleb's boots, and physically braced against his shins until he regained balance. Then the dog surged upward again, barking through the bay opening ahead where pale daylight and blowing snow flashed in violent intervals. They burst into the north storage bay just as Jeb and one of Grant's workers came diving in on the rope line to help. "Is that all?" Jeb shouted. Caleb opened his mouth to answer and stopped. "Count." He counted automatically, the way combat had burned counting into his bones. The rescued boy. Liam. Sadie. The 3 little ones. Talbot. 14 children already transferred. 17 total. He looked at Mara. She was counting too. Their eyes met. One missing. Not the boy. Another. "No," she said, voice flattening with dawning horror. "No. There were 17. The worker looked from one to the other confused. Jeb swore under his breath like a man seeing fresh disaster take shape in real time. "Which one?" Sadie, curled around Liam near the bay wall, lifted her head slowly. Snow blew through the broken opening behind her. "Molly," she whispered. She sat with April. The name landed like a body. Caleb turned instantly back toward the stair. Mara caught his arm so hard it hurt. "You can't. She's still down there. That room is gone. Then I go where she is." It should have been enough that he had just crawled out alive with another child in his arms. It should have been enough that the blizzard still raged, the roof still shifted, and the town below was full of parents praying over a count they believed was about to become final. But rescue is cruel in exactly this way. It never cares what should be enough. It only cares what remains undone. Mara looked at him, and whatever fear had lived in her all night finally stripped itself bare. "If you go back in there, you might not come out. Do you understand me now?" He did. He had understood that every time he moved toward danger since the day he first learned how little skin and bone meant to a collapsing structure. Ghost stood between them, chest heaving, head turning from Caleb to the stair, to Sadie, back to Caleb again. Then the shepherd made the decision for all of them. He trotted to Sadie, pressed his nose against her shaking hand, then turned and went straight back to the stairwell without waiting for command. Not frantic. Not wrong. Sure. Caleb felt something cold and final settle into place inside him. "He's got her scent," he said. Mara's eyes closed for a split second. Not in surrender. In pain. Then she opened them and the medic was back in full. 2 minutes. He stared. "What?" "You go in. 2 minutes. I hold the line, stabilize the bay, and if you're not back by then I come after you or I drag your body out trying. I'm done standing still while men I love disappear into winter." The last word wasn't winter. It was love, and it hit him harder than the collapse had. There was no time to answer it, no clean way to hold it, but it changed the air between them all the same. He nodded once. Jeb shoved a second rope into his hands and tied it around Caleb's waist with fingers that shook from cold and age and urgency. "You tug twice, we haul if we can," the old man said. "If the beam goes, I cut the line before it takes the rest of us. Do it." Grant Holloway appeared then at the bay opening, face raw from wind and fear, one worker behind him with blankets. The sight of the broken chamber stopped him. For the first time all night, his authority had no shape left to wear. "What happened?" Caleb looked at him and saw the whole town's old contempt rotting in the man's eyes under fresh terror. "You laughed at a broken shelter," he said. "That happened." Then he went back down. The chamber was worse now. Much worse. The second collapse had punched the front section inward and torn open a new breach to the storm, filling the lower room with swirling snow, splintered timber, and the smell of freshly broken concrete. There were no clear lines anymore, only pockets of space between fallen beams and leaning wall fragments. Ghost moved through it like memory, white coat flashing between dust and darkness, nose low, body tight. Caleb followed the rope with one hand and the dog with the rest of himself. "Molly!" he shouted. Nothing. Then Ghost barked once and pawed at a mound where part of the old bunk frame had folded under a wall panel. Caleb dropped to the spot and listened. At first only wind. Then the thinnest whimper in the world, almost too weak to count as sound. He clawed snow and splinters away until he found a tiny gloved hand trapped under broken shelfwood. Alive. He dug faster. The beam overhead complained. The rope behind him twitched once as Mara or Jeb checked tension. Ghost dug at the opposite side, not at the child directly but at the release point where the shelf had pinned against the support leg. Good dog. Good impossible dog. Caleb cleared enough to see the little girl's face. Molly. Eyes open. Crying without strength. "Hey," he said, dropping his voice into the gentlest place he owned. "I found you." Her lips moved. He leaned closer. "Cold. I know." The shelf had trapped her coat and lower leg, but not crushed her. He snapped the coat strap with his knife, shoved the shelf edge up with both forearms, and dragged her toward him inch by inch while Ghost braced against the shifting debris. The support leg slipped. Snow poured in. Caleb got Molly free and curled his body over hers just as a section of sidewall caved where they had been kneeling. Dust swallowed everything. The rope jerked hard from above. 2 minutes had passed or the world had. Caleb did not know which. He only knew that Ghost was still barking somewhere in front of him, and that the child in his arms was breathing into his jacket. He shouted once, twice, then felt the line go tight as Jeb and Mara started hauling. He moved with it, one arm around Molly, one hand on the rope, crawling through a half-buried chamber that was no longer a room but the inside of a collapse. Ghost never left his side. When Caleb finally hit the stairwell, the whole shelter seemed to shudder in fury. He climbed blind for the first 6 steps, Molly clutched under his chin, snow and dust in his mouth, until strong hands grabbed his jacket. Mara's voice hit him like a flare in dark water, and the North Bay pulled him back into the world of the living. The second he cleared the opening, the lower chamber gave way completely behind him with a roar that threw snow through the broken bay and dropped everyone to their knees. The sound rolled down the ridge and into frost line below like a verdict. For one suspended heartbeat no one moved. Then Molly coughed against Caleb's chest. Mara laughed and cried at the same time. Jeb swore a prayer. Ghost leaped up, front paws on Caleb's thigh, checking the child first, then the man, as if he alone had the right to confirm the rescue was truly done. Above them the storm still raged, but something had shifted now. Not in the weather. In the town. Because every parent in Frost Line was about to learn that the children came back alive not because of planning, not because of leadership, not because of the men who laughed loudest in daylight, but because one grieving veteran kept fixing a broken shelter nobody respected, and one white shepherd refused to stop digging at the same spot until the mountain gave them back. The news reached Frost Line before Caleb did, because hope moves faster downhill than trucks ever can in a storm. By the time he stepped out of the North Bay with Molly wrapped inside his field jacket and Ghost pacing so close his shoulder brushed the child's dangling boots, the first parents were already climbing the ridgeline through the white under Jeb's shouted orders, slipping on drifts, falling to their knees, getting up again because love does not know how to stop just because a mountain tells it to. The blizzard was still bad enough to blind a man in open ground, but there are moments in weather when a town begins to hear something stronger than the storm, and on that ridge the sound was not wind anymore. It was children's names being answered. Mara took Molly from Caleb the second they reached the rope line and passed her down to 2 waiting women with blankets and hot packs. Then she turned back to him as if to say 1,000 things, saw the way he was standing, and changed the whole conversation into one practical act instead. She put both hands on his face, checked his pupils the way she would check anyone in triage, then pressed her forehead briefly to his before stepping away to the next crisis. He watched her go for one stunned half-second, dust and snow still melting down his neck, then followed Ghost downhill because the rescue was not finished just because the mountain had finally stopped taking children one at a time. Below the shelter, the square around the war memorial had become a human pulse under storm light. Trucks idled. Headlamps cut white tunnels through the air. The church doors stood open, spilling weak gold into the drift. Men carried cots. Women cried into scarves and gloves and the shoulders of strangers they barely liked in daylight. The first line of rescued children had already reached the church basement annex, and each reunion coming out of that door shook the whole town in visible waves. A mother saw a red hat and became sound. A father who had not wept at his own father's funeral dropped to both knees in slush when his son came around the truck bed alive. People kept turning toward the ridge as if expecting it to take the children back until they physically touched them. Caleb had seen battlefields quieter than that square. He had also seen relief curdle quickly into blame if nobody gave it a structure, and that part of his brain was still working even while the rest of him tried to understand what his body had survived in the last hour. "Count again," he said to the deputy as soon as he reached the memorial. The man's face was white with cold and something larger than cold. 17. All 17. Caleb made him say it twice. Not because he did not hear, but because there are numbers you need spoken again before the dead parts of a man's mind will permit belief. 17. Every child from the bus. Talbot alive. The teacher breathing. Noah and the row house residents warmed through. One mother dead below the collapsed dormitory with her daughter above ground to cry for her later. A final count that was not perfect because no rescue count ever is, but was still close enough to grace that it made the square look like a place lit from beneath. Then Grant Holloway stepped up onto the truck bumper by the memorial and tried to turn it into a speech. Caleb saw it happening the way he had once seen men reaching for weapons under shawls or leaning a little too calm beside hidden explosives. Same body language. Same panic-wearing ceremony as camouflage. Grant lifted one gloved hand, called for quiet, and began talking about town strength, about a community effort, about everyone pulling together under impossible conditions. He had made it 3 sentences before Ghost barked. Not at the sound of a man speaking, but at falsehood itself, if a dog can be said to understand such a thing. The white shepherd moved out from beside Caleb, crossed the square through blowing snow, and stopped directly below the truck, staring up at Grant with a cold stillness that silenced the whole place more effectively than shouting ever could. Then one of the children, little April Green, wrapped in 3 blankets and standing between Mara and an older volunteer, lifted one mittened hand and pointed. "That dog found us," she said. Her voice was weak, but not weak enough to be swallowed by the hush. Another child turned, eyes red from cold and tears. "Mr. Caleb's shelter saved us." Then Sadie, the older student who had held the line in the lower chamber when no adult could reach them, stepped out from under her blanket and faced the town in a way no teenagers should have to. Snow melted in her hair. Her jaw still shook. But she stood straight. "We got out of the bus because we saw that shelter," she said. "Ghost showed us the vent. Mr. Talbot got us inside. Mr. Caleb came back for everybody. He came back for Molly too. There are accusations and there are verdicts." That was a verdict. Grant's face emptied. For the first time since Caleb had known him, the man looked smaller than his coat. Jeb Mercer, standing with one hand on the war memorial and the other around a lantern, said what the whole town now understood but had not yet had the courage to phrase. "Funny thing," he called into the white. "A man spends years laughing at a shelter because he thinks he'll never need it. Then one storm later and the only thing standing between this town and a graveyard full of children is the place he called worthless." No one answered him because no one could. The truth had already done its damage. Caleb should have felt something hot then. Satisfaction. Vindication. Maybe even anger sharpened into triumph. Instead, he felt only tired in a way that made his bones seem older than his years. Not because the town had finally seen him clearly. That part barely mattered. What mattered was that 17 children were alive in the church basement, and one woman was not, and the storm was still strong enough that the next crisis could start before this one had even learned how to sit down. He turned away from Grant and headed toward the church with Ghost at his side. People tried to stop him. Parents reached for his sleeve. A father with tears freezing on his beard grabbed his hand and held it too long because language had failed him. Caleb let all of it happen without really entering it. In the basement annex, Mara was moving between cots with a heat gun and trauma shears, assigning warm fluids, checking pulse ox, forcing children to keep talking so sleep would not take them into the dangerous part of hypothermia. The room smelled of wet wool, steam, antiseptic, cocoa from somewhere, and the strange metallic trace that all mass rescues carry after the cold is briefly beaten back. Caleb stopped in the doorway and watched his daughter work. Not Emma. Mara. He had almost said Emma because grief still did that to him in exhausted moments, blurred one impossible beloved woman into another. But Mara Vale was wholly her own force, and when she finally looked up and saw him standing there caked in dust, one side of his face cut, and one glove torn through at the palm, something changed in her expression that had nothing to do with medicine. "Sit," she said. He did not. Caleb. The second time held enough command to be military. He sat. Ghost lay down immediately against his boots, finally still after hours of motion. Mara crossed the room, crouched in front of him, and cleaned the cut at his temple with a cloth hot enough to sting the exhaustion back into him. "You should have let the ridge have you the first time it asked," she muttered, not because she meant it, but because anger was easier to voice than relief. He watched her hands. "You said you'd come after me?" "I meant it." "I know." She looked up then, and all the brittle edges between them, the years of town rumor, the careful distance, the professional respect that hid a deeper understanding neither of them had touched, seemed suddenly too small for what the night had become. "You don't get to do that again," she said quietly. "Choose dying like it's just another tool in the box." Caleb thought of Hannah on the icy county road. Thought of his own daughter not looking at him at the funeral because she did not know whether anger or love should win. Thought of Molly's weight under his jacket, and the trapped mother in the lower dormitory with the red scarf in her hand. "I wasn't choosing dying," he said. "I was choosing not leaving them." Mara's face changed, softened in the dangerous way a face softens when it understands the thing it most feared was never selfishness, only grief repurposed into duty. She tied off the bandage at his temple and sat back on her heels. "That's not always different," she said. Before he could answer, April Green crossed the room still wrapped in blankets, and put something in his lap. It was the little church key her classmate had found in the lower chamber, tied now to a strip of red yarn somebody must have salvaged from the scarf. "For the shelter," she whispered. "Because it opens things." Then she stepped back to Ghost and rested one tiny hand on the shepherd's neck. The dog lifted his head, leaned into the touch, and closed his eyes for the first time that night. No ceremony could have struck Caleb harder. Because children know instinctively how to give meaning to objects adults only know how to inventory. Outside, the storm finally began to tire. Not end. Tiring and ending are different things in Montana. But the pressure changed. The wind shortened. Snow no longer drove in knives but in softer blown sheets. County plows would make the lower pass by morning. Engineers would come. Questions would come. Grant and the council would have their reckoning. Frost Line would spend years telling and retelling where everyone had stood when the bus vanished, when Ghost dug, when the hatch opened, when the first child came out. But in that basement, under the church that had nearly become a tomb, the night narrowed to simpler truths. Breath returning to cheeks. The shape of a dog at a man's feet. A medic crouched between grief and survival, refusing to let either one win too easily. After midnight, when the last of the children had stabilized and most of the adults had finally stopped moving enough to hear their own bodies again, the deputy came downstairs and said the county emergency director was on the road up from the south. He also said, in the careful tone people use when approaching a live mine, that the town council wanted to see Caleb in the morning regarding use of the shelter going forward. Caleb almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was almost too perfectly human. Mock a thing until it saves you, then immediately ask how to formalize it. Jeb arrived 10 minutes later with a thermos of coffee and the old civil defense map they had found in the courthouse archive. He spread it on the church table under a heater lamp. The shelter system looked smaller on paper than it had felt in the storm. North chamber, vent intake, church line, dormitory extension, row house branch. But there it was, sketched decades earlier by men who had known the mountain would someday force a choice between secrecy and survival. Jeb tapped the shelter symbol with one scarred finger. "You kept this place alive with plywood and stubbornness," he said. "Town ought to know that before they start pretending they were always behind you." Caleb looked at the map, then at Ghost, then toward the basement room where the children slept in uneven rows of borrowed blankets. "Towns are better at memory after they survive something." "Sometimes," Jeb said. "And sometimes they need help remembering right." Caleb understood that too. He had spent 3 years in Frost Line learning how quickly people turned discomfort into narrative. The veteran was strange. The shelter was broken. The dog was obsessive. These had become accepted facts because they were easier than admitting someone grieving had seen danger more clearly than the comfortable had. Now the facts had changed. The town would not know what to do with that by morning. Somewhere above them, in the dark church hall, one of the parents began singing softly to a child too restless to sleep. The tune carried down the stairs in fragments, gentle and rough-edged and painfully ordinary. Caleb sat with the key in one hand and Ghost's head under the other until the song ended and the last of the adrenaline finally began to drain from his body. It left behind the part no rescue can heal quickly, the image of the trapped mother's hand around the red scarf, the look in Mara's eyes when she thought the bulkhead had sealed him away, the understanding that every life saved arrives trailing shadows of the ones you could not. That was the true tax of survival. Not the wounds. The memory of selection. Ghost shifted at his boots and looked up at him with the same calm intelligence he had worn in snow, dust, dark, and collapse. Caleb rubbed a hand slowly down the dog's neck. "You were right," he murmured. The shepherd gave one soft breath through his nose, as if agreement was unnecessary between them. Outside, Frost Line remained buried under blizzard white. Inside, for the first time in years, Caleb did not feel entirely outside the human world. Not because the town had changed. Towns take longer than storms. But because the thing he built out of grief had held. And because one white shepherd had not stopped digging until every buried truth worth saving came back into the light. Morning did not so much arrive over Frost Line as reveal what the storm had spent the night hiding. When Caleb stepped out of the church just after first light, the town looked less rescued than exposed. Snow sat on every roofline in thick brutal slabs. Pickup trucks were buried to their doors. The pines above the ridge stood bowed under white weight, and the broken shelter on Caleb's land looked like the mountain had tried to bite it in half and failed. Steam rose from the reopened vent line in pale twisting ghosts. The war memorial and the shelter ridge beyond it had become one visual fact in the town's mind now, one place, one story, one humiliation turned miracle. Men from County Emergency Management were finally working their way up the main road in chains and bright jackets, but the first real work of mourning had already begun before they arrived. Frost Line was counting itself. Counting children. Counting injuries. Counting failures. Counting who had been where when the blizzard turned from inconvenience into judgment. Caleb stood on the church steps with his coat unzipped at the throat, dried blood at his temple, bandage under one ear, and watched parents move between the annex and the square with their changed faces. The gratitude was real. So was the shame. People could hold both at once after a night like that. Ghost stood beside him, white coat bright in the new daylight, tactical K9 jacket scuffed, chest fur still carrying traces of dust from the lower collapse. Every few seconds some child would break away from a blanket, or a waiting adult, and come touch the dog as if making sure he was not another impossible thing the storm had invented and then taken back. Ghost accepted every small hand with the same grave patience he had shown in the shelter. He was not basking in affection. He was still working, still checking the edges of fear, moving toward whichever child's breathing rose too sharply, then drifting away once it calmed. Caleb knew that rhythm intimately. Working dogs did not stop because the headline moment had passed. They stayed in mission until the room itself changed temperature. Mara found him there with a clipboard under one arm and 2 paper cups of coffee steaming in her gloved hands. She held one out without a word. He took it. The coffee was thin and burnt, and one of the best things he had ever tasted. They stood like that for a while, not speaking, because there are silences that avoid truth and silences that make it possible. This was the second kind. Below them in the square, Jeb Mercer had already spread the old civil defense map across the hood of a truck and was arguing with the county engineer over the structural condition of the surviving shelter chambers. The deputy. No one called him Deputy Kane this morning, not even the people who disliked him, because the storm had stripped titles down to usefulness, was moving file boxes from the church hall to the town office under escort from 2 county men who suddenly looked very interested in municipal records. Grant Holloway stood near the memorial with his expensive coat dusted in salt and thaw, trying to speak quietly to the emergency director in a way that suggested he still believed tone could outrun evidence. It could not. Not after a town heard children say with one frightened honest mouth that the place they were told was worthless had saved them. Mara blew once across her cup. They're all asking the same question. Caleb watched April Green tie and untie a piece of yarn around Ghost's vest strap while her mother cried quietly to one side and pretended she wasn't. Which one? Why, nobody knew the shelter was still alive. Caleb looked toward Grant. Mara followed his gaze. They'll want a villain before noon. They already had one, Caleb said. They just called him prepared when he wore a clean coat. That almost made her smile, but the night was still too close for anything that easy. She shifted the clipboard under her arm. County wants statements. The parents want to thank you. Jeb wants you at the map review. And the council, what's left of it, wants to discuss emergency designation of the shelter. Caleb let out one quiet breath that held no humor in it at all. Of course they do. Mara studied him then in the sharp, honest light of morning. You don't have to make this easy for them. I'm not interested in making anything easy. Good. She glanced down at her clipboard, then back at him. Because by my count, they laughed at you for 3 winters, ignored every warning, mocked the shelter until their own children had to breathe because of it, and now they're already trying to act like this was always a shared idea. Caleb took another sip of coffee and let the heat sit in his mouth a second before swallowing. That's what towns do when they survive something ugly. They edit. Are you going to let them? He looked down at Ghost, at the dust still caught in the dog's winter fur, at the little wear mark on the black vest handle where frightened children had clung to it through the dark. No, he said. The answer surprised both of them with how quickly it came. Maybe because the night had changed something inside him that grief had locked shut for years. Not healed it. Healing was smaller and more patient. But shifted it. He had spent too long standing outside Frost Lyon's version of him, the damaged veteran, the man with the broken shelter, the one whose usefulness belonged only in old stories and disaster fantasies. He had tolerated their editing because correcting them felt too much like asking to be seen, and asking to be seen after loss can feel unbearably close to begging. But the storm had removed the luxury of silence. 17 children had used his shelter to stay alive. One woman had died beneath his roof because the system hidden under the town had been rationed and controlled by cowards. He could not let that be rewritten into weather. Before Mara could answer, a little boy in a blue coat, Liam, the one Ghost had found behind the furnace panel, approached with the careful solemnity only children and priests manage well. In his mittened hands he held something wrapped in a dish towel. Mom said to give this to the dog, he said. Mara crouched to his height. What is it? Sausage. He looked at Ghost, then at Caleb. For saving everybody. Ghost sniffed the towel bundle once and sat down. Caleb nodded toward the boy. You can give it to him. Liam's whole face changed. He stepped forward and held out the bundle with both mittens. Ghost took it with the kind of gentleness that always made adults watch him twice. The boy laughed, a real laugh this time, not a shaken survival sound. It did something to the square. Tiny as it was, the laugh spread. Not like joy exactly. More like permission. Permission for bodies that had been locked in fear all night to start remembering they were still human. Mara rose slowly. That, she said softly, is going to be harder for them to edit out. She was right. Because by mid-morning the children were talking. They talked in clusters on cots, at kitchen tables, in the church hall beside cocoa urns, wrapped in blankets, while county medics checked oxygen saturation and frostbite risk. They told the same details over and over because children know instinctively where the true center of an event was even when adults are already trying to flatten it into procedure. They talked about seeing the broken shelter through the white. About the bus driver steering toward it because there was nothing else left to steer toward. About the lower chamber being dark and warm and smelling like old metal. About Ghost barking at the vent before they crawled in. About Mr. Caleb coming back down the stairs again and again and again. About the older girl, Sadie, who made everyone stay low and share coats. About the moment the ceiling dropped, and the white dog stood over Molly while the grown-ups pulled her free. None of those details were political. That was exactly why they were dangerous. Jeb understood that before anyone. He waved Caleb down to the truck hood where the map was spread. County engineer says the north chamber and the church line can be stabilized with temporary support by tonight if the weather holds. He tapped the dormitory extension with one gnarled finger. Lower section is gone. Too much collapse. They won't risk a full excavation till tomorrow. Caleb knew what lay under that square of paper. A trapped mother with a red scarf in her hand and no use left for daylight. He looked away from the map toward the ridge cemetery above town. April needs to know before she hears it sideways. Jeb nodded, older eyes gentling. Mara said she'd tell the mother with the pastor there. Caleb absorbed that. Another burden taken up before he had even asked. And Grant? Jeb gave a short, humorless sound. Grant's trying to convince the county he maintained emergency contingency oversight over the shelter system. Caleb stared at him. He really said that out loud? Almost those exact words. Which was unwise, seeing as 3 children have already said in front of the emergency director that he laughed at your storm shelter yesterday afternoon. That should have been satisfying. It was not. It was merely necessary. Jeb leaned in a little closer over the map. They'll want you to take responsibility for it now, you know. The usable parts of the system. The shelter. Emergency board. Winter protocol. All the things they mocked until they needed them. Caleb looked down at the contour lines and old branch markings under Jeb's hand. He had built the shelter back toward life because he could not bear another winter with no answer ready. He had not done it to become anything official. Yet the thought of handing it to town council men and county consultants who had never once laid awake listening to storm pressure against a weak roof filled him with a disgust so clean it was almost clarity. If they use it, he said, it gets run right. Not as a secret. Not as leverage. Not as another damn excuse to decide whose life is worth preparing for. Jeb's expression sharpened with respect. Then say that when they ask? They did ask. An hour later, in the church hall under fluorescent lights and the smell of wet coats, the remaining council members, county emergency staff, the deputy, and a half-dozen residents gathered for what Frostline liked to call a practical conversation and what Caleb recognized instantly as a struggle over ownership disguised as administration. Grant Holloway tried to shape the first few minutes by emphasizing municipal complexity, insurance questions, and public safety liability, but the room had shifted beneath him. It happened in visible ways. No one laughed when he spoke. No one leaned toward him. One of his own yard men kept his eyes on the floor the whole time. Mara stood against the far wall with crossed arms and a medic clipboard still under one elbow, saying nothing and somehow making Grant look smaller each time he talked. Caleb waited until the emergency director asked the only real question in the room. Mr. Reese, what do you believe this structure needs right now? Caleb answered without sitting. Full public inventory. Structural reinforcement where possible. Permanent marked access at the ridge and church line. Vent maintenance under independent oversight. No lock sectors without emergency sign-off from county, not town council. And every record tied to property pressure around that shelter gets turned over. Silence followed. Not the kind that resists. The kind that recognizes a better mind has already reached the point. Grant started to object, but Mara cut across him. And if anybody wants to argue that, she said, they can explain to the parents outside why their children came back alive through a shelter they spent years pretending did not matter. No one argued after that. Outside the church, Ghost waited in the pale sun beside the steps as if he had known the outcome before the humans did. When Caleb came out, the dog rose, stretched stiffly, and leaned one side into his leg for a second. Caleb rested a hand between the shepherd's shoulders and looked across Frostline. Snow still covered everything. Grief still lived where it had lived yesterday. The dead were not suddenly less dead. But something in the town's shape had changed. The shelter on the ridge was no longer a private wound he had nailed boards over in silence. It had become a public fact. And public facts, once spoken aloud by children, are much harder to bury than men like Grant Holloway ever wanted to believe. By afternoon, parents had started climbing to the ridge in small groups just to stand near the shelter and look at it properly, as if seeing it in daylight could help their bodies accept what their children had already lived through. Some brought thermoses. Some brought blankets. One father brought a box of nails and left it by the door without saying a word. Another mother placed a wreath of winter pine on the memorial rail below the vent box. No speeches. No performative gratitude. Just the awkward plain offerings people make when language has failed them and work remains the only decent apology. Caleb saw all of it from a distance while he and Jeb measured the surviving support lines. He did not stop them. He did not thank them either. Not yet. Some things needed time to settle before they were real. That evening, just before dusk, April Green came up the ridge holding her mother's hand and carrying something folded under one arm. She walked straight to Ghost, who was lying near the repaired intake trench, and draped the object over the rail beside him. It was a child's scarf, red wool, too long for her, the same color as the one the trapped mother had held when the mountain took the last thing it was willing to take. "So he remembers where to find us," April said. Her mother started crying then, quietly, into one glove. Caleb looked away toward the pines because some emotions arrived too cleanly to survive direct witness. Ghost lifted his head, looked at the scarf, then at Caleb, and settled back down with a calm so complete it seemed almost ceremonial. The storm had ended. The work had not. But for the first time since Hannah died, Caleb did not feel like winter had the final word. That night, after the county trucks finally chained their way back down the pass and frost lines settled into the uneasy quiet that follows public survival, Caleb Reese walked alone to the shelter with a lantern in one hand and Ghost at his side. The town below glowed in scattered patches through the cold, church windows lit, generator hums drifting up the hill, headlights moving slowly where road crews still cut paths through drifts taller than children. From a distance, it might have looked peaceful. Up close, peace had not yet earned the right to call itself that. The ridge still smelled of snapped pine, ruptured insulation, diesel, and fresh broken concrete. The shelter itself was a wounded thing now, the front section torn open where the collapse had taken it, the north bay half braced with emergency timber, the vent stack breathing steadier than it had in years. Caleb stood in the snow and listened to the new sound the place made. Not the hard enclosed hum of a hidden refuge. Something more open. More honest. The mountain had ripped its secrecy apart, and for the first time since he inherited the land, the shelter was no longer pretending to be anything other than what it truly was, a scar that had learned how to keep other people alive. Ghost padded ahead, stopped at the memorial line, then turned his head toward the lower slope where the old cemetery fence cut across the ridge in black angles beneath the snow. Caleb followed his gaze and saw Mara climbing toward him with a flashlight and a folded wool blanket tucked under one arm. He had not heard her truck. She moved that quietly when she wanted to. "I thought you'd be here," she said when she reached the flat. Her voice had lost the clipped command it carried all day and settled into something softer, though no less direct. "Jeb says you haven't eaten?" "Jeb says a lot. He also says men who skip meals after adrenaline are usually trying not to feel what comes after." Caleb gave the smallest exhale that might have become a laugh in warmer weather. "And what do you say?" Mara handed him the blanket first, not because he needed it more than she did, but because she had already decided he would take it. "I say he's right." They stood side by side in the blue-black cold, the shelter on one side of them, the town on the other, and Ghost moving in a slow, patient circle around both, nose down in the snow, checking the edges the way he always did before lying down. Somewhere below, a truck backfired. Somewhere farther off, the church bell rang once, likely someone testing the cracked clapper after the storm. The sound drifted up thin and lonely and impossibly normal. Mara looked at the front collapse line, at the braces, at the drift where children had climbed out alive less than a day earlier. "April asked me this evening if the shelter was always trying to save people or if it only started last night." Caleb tucked the blanket tighter around his shoulders. "What did you tell her?" "I told her places don't try. People do." She let that sit between them. Then she said Ghost tried. Caleb glanced down at the dog. Ghost had finally chosen a spot beside the vent trench and was lying there with his head on his paws, white coat silvered by moonlight on snow. She's right about that part. Mara nodded. I know. Silence opened again, but it was no longer the awkward silence of people unsure where to step around each other. It was the silence of two tired souls standing near the same fire after a war, too empty to posture, too honest to pretend nothing had changed. Caleb watched the steam rise from the vent and thought of Hannah the winter before she died, kneeling in the mud beside these same cracked walls, laughing at him because he had come home from his final stateside training block with a stack of salvaged manuals and a truck bed full of sheet metal like a man possessed. She had called the shelter ugly, but never worthless. She had brought coffee out in the cold and sat on the broken step while he patched seams and muttered over vent lines. She had said more than once that grief and purpose looked dangerously similar from a distance, and he needed to be careful which one he was building with. He had not answered her then because she was alive, and there would always be time later to answer people who loved you. That is one of the cruelest assumptions human beings make. Mara must have seen the shift in his face because she asked no practical question next. She asked the one that cost something. What was she like? Caleb did not look at her at first. He looked at the shelter, at the ruin and the repair and the broken front where the storm had tried to make a mockery of all his stubbornness and failed. Hannah? Mara nodded. He let the name sit in his mouth a second, warm and painful and real. She hated when people mistook competence for kindness. Said small towns were full of men who knew how to hold a meeting and not a hand. She laughed at me a lot. Not cruelly. Just enough to keep me from becoming unbearable. Mara smiled despite herself, and it changed the whole hardness of her face. I would have liked her. You would have thought. Probably. Caleb finally looked at her then. She would have liked that. Something about hearing it aloud in the cold, under the shelter he built after losing Hannah, with Mara standing beside him after the longest night Frost Line had seen in years, loosened a knot in him that had been part of his breathing for so long he no longer noticed it as separate pain. He did not cry. Not because tears were impossible. Because grief was doing something quieter and stranger. It was making room. Mara stepped closer then, close enough that their shoulders touched through layers of wool and canvas and bandages and fatigue. Neither made ceremony of it. They found Mrs. Keller's body this afternoon, she said softly. Caleb closed his eyes once. He had known they would. The engineers had stabilized enough of the lower collapse to recover her, and Father Callow had stayed near the church doors when they brought her out beneath a tarp, head bowed, the red scarf folded over one arm because April could not yet bear to see it. April asked if her mother was brave. Mara continued. I told her yes. But I also told her the truth. That brave doesn't always mean not afraid. Sometimes it means deciding what matters most while you're still terrified. Caleb swallowed. The night gave him nothing easy. It never had. Did she believe you? Mara looked toward the town. She believed Ghost. That got the laugh out of him properly this time, low and rough and gone too fast, but real enough that Ghost lifted his head as if to confirm the sound had happened. Mara let herself smile fully now. She thinks he's some kind of snow guardian. He'd be insufferable if he understood branding. Too late. Half the town already talks about him like he personally insulted the storm. Caleb looked down at the dog, who had returned his chin to his paws with the complete serenity of a being who had saved lives and still considered vent monitoring his actual job. He kind of did. The humor faded slowly, naturally, into something more fragile. Mara turned toward him. Caleb. He knew from the way she said his name that there was no deflecting what came next. When the bulkhead shut, she said, I thought that was it. He did not answer. And when the lower chamber came down the second time, and you were still inside. She stopped, not from lack of language, but because some truths become larger than speech if you stand too close to them. Caleb looked out over Frost Line, over the roofs and church windows and patched roads, and felt the old reflex rise in him, the one that wanted to reassure, to minimize, to make his own risk sound functional and therefore emotionally unimportant. He did not do it. That was new too. I was afraid, he said. Mara inhaled sharply, maybe because she had expected stoicism, maybe because she knew what it cost him to admit the simple human thing instead. Not of dying, he went on. Not exactly. I was afraid of leaving another room full of people with me missing from it. The cold deepened around them. Or perhaps it only felt that way because the sentence had opened something raw. Mara reached out then and touched the back of his hand where it rested on the blanket edge. No drama. No speech. Just contact. It was enough to split him cleanly through the middle because the last hand that had rested on his in weather like this had been Hannah's. He did not pull away. Neither did she. Ghost rose then, not because he sensed danger, but because he sensed completion. He crossed the drift between them, pressed once against both their legs, then turned and walked to the shelter door where he sat and looked back, ears up, as if reminding them there was still work to do and the living do not get to drown in feeling while structures remain unswept. Mara wiped once under one eye with the back of her glove and shook her head in amazement that held no embarrassment. He always knows when a moment's gone too long. Caleb nodded. That's why he survived me. They went inside together. The shelter smelled different in the dark with only lantern light and moon through the blown-open front. The old main chamber, partly braced and half exposed to the storm, no longer felt like a private ruin. County tags now marked the stable walls. Emergency blankets sat stacked in public view. The intake line hummed with restored airflow. On the far wall, Jeb had already chalked measurements and load notes for the morning reinforcement team. The place had been absorbed into the town's future before the town fully understood what that meant. Mara moved slowly through the room, taking in the shelf where Caleb kept old manuals, the tool bench with sorted bolts and washers and coffee tins, the hand-drawn Venn diagrams taped crookedly above the heater line, the extra child-sized wool blankets he had stored without ever admitting to himself why he had bought them. You really thought this far ahead, she said quietly. Caleb shrugged. I thought if Winter wanted another life, it should at least have to work harder for it. Mara's eyes landed on the box of crayons tucked beside the radio batteries. He followed her gaze and almost looked away. Hannah put those there, he said. Said if children ever ended up in this shelter, they should have proof the world intended them to keep being children afterward. Mara touched the top of the box with one fingertip. That might be the saddest thing I've ever heard. Yeah. And the best. They stood in that truth for a while. Outside, the wind moved softer now over the ridge. The storm had spent itself. Frost's line had not. There would be hearings. Anger. Men trying to salvage reputations with procedural language. Insurance evaluations. Structural reports. The politics of gratitude, which are often uglier than the gratitude itself. But not tonight. Tonight there was just the shelter, the dog, the woman who had stayed, and the man who had finally stopped pretending that survival and healing were separate assignments. When Mara left, it was close to midnight. At the door she paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back at him with the kind of steadiness that asks for no promise because it intends to remain regardless. Get some sleep, she said. That sounds like a threat from you. Good. Hear it as one. Then she stepped into the snow and walked down the ridge toward town, lantern swinging low, red scarf tucked under her arm for April in the morning. Caleb stood in the doorway until her light became another star among the house lamps below. Then he looked down. Ghost was already curled beside the threshold, one eye open, as if waiting to see whether the man would finally do the sensible thing. Caleb sat down on the step instead, back against the cracked frame, and the dog shifted until his shoulder pressed warm against Caleb's leg. The memorial stood black against the snowfield below. The vent breathed steady. Somewhere in the church annex, 17 children slept because a broken storm shelter had held, because a retired SEAL never quite forgot how to move toward danger, and because one white German shepherd had trusted his own instincts more than an entire town trusted its laughter. Caleb closed his eyes, not to sleep just yet, but to listen. No sirens. No collapsing beam. No frantic pounding from beneath the floor. Just the mountain settling under snow, and the shelter breathing under repair. For the first time in years, winter did not feel like an enemy waiting at the door. It felt like something he had finally answered. 3 days after the blizzard, Frost Line stopped sounding like a place under siege and started sounding like a place under judgment. Not from the state. Not from the county engineers clanging through the shelter braces with clipboards and hard hats. Not even from the insurance men who arrived with worried eyes and polite shoes completely unsuited for mountain mud. The judgment came from ordinary voices. From kitchen tables. From the post office line. From the mothers who had watched their children sleep under borrowed blankets in the church annex, and now looked at the ridge shelter with a reverence edged by anger. From the men who had laughed with Grant Holloway outside the lumber yard and now could not meet Caleb's eyes for more than a second before glancing toward Ghost instead, as if the dog were somehow easier to apologize to. Small towns do not change quickly, but when they do, they change in the open, where everybody can watch the old story crack. That week, the old story died by inches. County crews stabilized the North Bay with temporary beams and reopened the church line shaft as a marked emergency access. Engineers sealed the lower collapse and raised a red zone barrier around the dormitory extension where Mrs. Keller had died, promising excavation only when the mountain could be trusted not to take more. Parents came to the ridge carrying thermoses, gloves, tool belts, and pieces of themselves they had not intended to give. One man brought fresh plywood. Another dropped off a portable generator without waiting to be thanked. The women from the east row houses cleaned the upper chamber, aired out blankets, washed soot from the surviving cots, and hung small battery lanterns near the wall where the children had huddled. It was not charity, and it was not guilt exactly. It was labor offered in place of the words they did not know how to say. Frost Line had spent too long using Caleb Reese as a mirror for everything uncomfortable in itself. Now the town had to learn what to do when the man they made into a warning became the reason their children kept breathing. Caleb did not make that lesson easy for them. He did not turn friendly overnight. He did not become the smiling local hero men like Grant would have preferred because smiling heroes are easier to absorb back into civic mythology. He showed up at dawn. He checked vent pressure. He rebuilt the North Bay floor plate with county approval and no patience for committee chatter. He listened to engineers only when they understood load paths better than he did. And when people thanked him too softly or too grandly, he nodded once and put another board in place. It was enough. More than enough, really, because by then everyone in Frost Line had heard the children tell it the same way. The bus slid, the world vanished white, the shelter appeared, the dog found the vent, Mr. Caleb came back down again and again, and the place everybody laughed at became the only warm thing on the mountain. You cannot out-talk children after rescue. Their version becomes the one that lasts. On the fourth morning after the storm, the town council called a public meeting in the church hall because there are some reckonings that require walls and witnesses. Half the town came. The other half stood in the doorway or just outside, where cold air kept sliding over boots and under the benches. Caleb almost did not attend. Mara made sure he did. She drove out to the shelter before sunrise with coffee in one hand and a stare in the other, and told him in the practical voice she used when changing dressings that if Frost Line was going to say his name in public, then it was going to do so while he was in the room to hear exactly how. He had no answer worth using against that. So he went. Ghost went too, because by then leaving him behind felt less like separation and more like a factual impossibility. The dog lay at Caleb's boots through the whole meeting, white fur bright against old church floorboards, tactical K9 vest newly cleaned but still scuffed where children's mittened hands had grabbed it in the dark. The first hour belonged to officials. The county engineer described the shelter network in measured terms. The emergency director outlined temporary control measures. The deputy gave his report, and in the telling, his own voice seemed to age again under the weight of what he had missed while serving under men who hid what mattered. Then the room turned to Grant Holloway. If there was mercy left for him in Frost Line, it was the kind that leaves a man breathing and calls that enough. He stood in a town he had once managed with polished certainty, and tried one last time to shape the narrative. He spoke of inherited failures, incomplete records, legal ambiguities, budget constraints, partial knowledge. He said he never meant for the shelter to remain hidden in a way that endangered the public. He said hard decisions had been made over the years under pressure from declining revenue and state abandonment. He spoke well, because men like him almost always do right up until language fails them. And then April Green, little boots not even touching the floor from her bench, raised her hand. The entire hall went still because no one had expected the interruption from a child. Father Callow nodded gently toward her from 2 pews over. April stood with the solemnity of someone much older and looked directly at Grant. "If you knew there was a safe place," she asked, "why didn't you tell our moms?" That was the end of language. Not because there were no words after it. Because none of the grown-up words left could survive that question. Grant opened his mouth, shut it, and looked down as if perhaps the wood grain might provide an answer his conscience would not. The silence that followed did more damage than any accusation. Caleb did not look at the man. He looked at April, at the red ribbon tied around one braid in memory of her mother, and then at Mara, who stood at the side wall with her arms folded and her expression unreadable except in one detail: pride. Not in the humiliation of a rival. In the truth coming from the right mouth. Jeb Mercer rose next. He did not clear his throat. He did not consult notes. He just stood with both old hands braced on the pew ahead of him and said what needed saying. "The town can debate policy all spring. It can drag papers through county offices and act surprised at maps men already drew in secret. But this part is simple. Caleb kept that shelter alive when no one asked him to. Ghost found what every one of us missed. The children lived because one grieving man treated Winter seriously while the rest of us treated him like a joke. He turned enough to include the whole room, and the whole room felt it. So let's stop flattering ourselves. Frost's line wasn't saved by planning. It was saved by a man we pushed to the edge and a dog who trusted him anyway." No one applauded. Applause would have cheapened it. What followed instead was harder and truer. People stood. One by one at first. Then in groups. Parents. The choir teacher. Noah from the clinic. Mrs. Delaney with her husband's arm around her shoulders. The bus driver, Talbot, one side of his face still yellowed purple from the injury, rising carefully because the stitches pulled if he moved too fast. They stood not to cheer like at a ball game, but to acknowledge. To bear witness. Caleb hated being looked at that directly. He hated, even more, the way his chest tightened at the sight of people he had spent years half avoiding now standing because they understood the shape of what they owed. Ghost rose too, not because he understood ovations, but because the room had changed temperature again and he wanted to see. When the meeting ended, the county formally transferred emergency operational oversight of the surviving shelter to a new local refuge board under county review. Jeb chaired. Mara took medical coordination. The deputy kept law and logistics. And Caleb, despite trying twice to refuse, was named structural lead and permanent winter response advisor for the site. It was not a medal. Not a title to hang on a wall. It was assignment. Responsibility. Work. Which was why, in the end, he accepted. The town did one more thing that day, small enough to sound sentimental if told wrong, but real enough in the moment to stop conversation entirely. They went to the memorial. All of them. The square was clear enough by then for children to stand without sinking to the knee. The repaired intake grate breathed a soft stream of warm air into the cold. County markers ringed the shelter access on the ridge, and fresh boards now reinforced the north bay under canvas tarps. April Green walked to the memorial rail carrying a narrow wooden plaque no bigger than a schoolbook. She had painted it with her teacher and 2 other children using borrowed brushes in the church basement, while adults argued over forms and structural plans. No one had told Caleb about it. She tied the plaque to the rail with red ribbon and stepped back. It was simple. White letters on dark wood. Ghost's Way. That was all. No slogan. No long message. Just the name the children had already been using for the vent path and lower entry route the white shepherd found beneath the snow. The adults looked at it, then at Ghost, then at Caleb. The dog tilted his head once at the sound of his own name spoken by 3 children at the same time and then, in perfect indifference to ceremony, sat down in the snow facing the shelter, as if his only concern remained whether the airflow sounded right. The square laughed then, but not with cruelty. Not at anyone. The sound came out of Frost's line like something that had thawed at last. Caleb looked away because grief can be ambushed by kindness even more easily than by loss. Mara must have seen it, because she moved closer without drawing attention, gloved hand brushing the back of his once, lightly, enough to anchor him and not enough to expose him. "You're allowed to stay," she said under her breath, so only he could hear. "What?" He kept his eyes on the vent steam, on the plaque, on Ghost, pretending none of this concerned him. "In the story," she said, "you don't have to live outside it anymore." That sentence followed him for days. It followed him up the ridge at dawn when he walked the vent line with Ghost. It followed him through the town when people stopped him not with pity but with questions that assumed he might answer. It followed him into the house that had been quiet for too long and which now, gradually, stopped feeling like a place where silence waited to trap him. On the 7th evening after the blizzard, Emma came. Not Mara. Emma. His daughter. She had stayed with an aunt in Missoula since the year Hannah died, coming back only for short visits, carrying her grief at an angle that never quite let it touch his directly. Caleb had not expected her until Christmas, maybe not even then. But when he opened the door at dusk, there she was on the porch in a long black coat with snow in her dark hair and a look on her face he had not seen since she was 15, and asking him to teach her how to drive on the lower logging road. Ghost saw her first, and whined low in a way he reserved for reunions that mattered. Emma dropped to her knees and buried her face in the dog's neck for a long time before standing. Then she looked at her father. There was no dramatic speech. That was not their way. She just held out a paper sack from the bakery in town and said, "I heard you forgot to eat for most of 3 days, so I'm starting by assuming you haven't improved." It was the best apology and forgiveness he had ever received because it sounded like either, and carried both. They ate in the kitchen with the porch light on, with Ghost under the table and the wind easy against the windows, and the house did not feel haunted. Still marked yes, but not ruled. Emma asked about the shelter. Asked about the children. Asked about Hannah in a way she had not managed in years. Caleb answered, sometimes badly, sometimes haltingly, but honestly enough that the spaces between them began to feel like bridges instead of cliffs. Outside, Frost's line breathed under fresh snow and new systems and old griefs arranged differently than before. Weeks later, when the lower dormitory was finally excavated and Mrs. Keller was laid to rest, the whole town turned out under a clear white sky. April placed the red scarf over the coffin before it was lowered, then walked back to Ghost and rested her hand on the dog's head the way children rest their faith on what proved itself. By then, the North Shelter was fully operational again. Not hidden. Not private. Not rationed by the whim of men who mistook power for stewardship. It stood above Frost's line as a public winter refuge with marked access, stocked shelves, emergency cots, and one small hand-painted sign in the entryway that the children insisted on making themselves. It read, "If the storm comes, follow the dog." Caleb left it there. On the first real storm drill of the next season, long before winter showed its teeth again, he stood on the ridge with Mara, Emma, Jeb, the deputy, and a dozen townspeople running heat checks and ladder clears below. Ghost moved between them all, white coat bright against the first thin snow of November, checking the familiar places, the vent, the hatch, the church line, the north bay seam, as serious as ever. Mara looked at the shelter, then at Caleb. "Still broken?" she asked. He followed her gaze. The patched walls. The reinforced roof line. The steam from the intake. The children's plaque on the memorial rail below. The people working instead of mocking. "Not anymore," he said. But the truth was larger than the shelter. Frost's line had not become perfect because one blizzard taught it a lesson. Towns stay flawed. People stay partial. Memory stays selective unless guarded. Yet something essential had shifted. The place that laughed now listened. The man they isolated now belonged. The grief that built in silence had become protection in daylight. And the white German shepherd who kept digging at the same spot had not only found a buried way into safety. He had led an entire town to the place where compassion, responsibility, and truth were finally impossible to ignore. That was the final image Caleb carried with him when winter returned in softer warnings later that year. Ghost sitting on the ridge by the warm breathing vent, looking down over frost line as twilight gathered, children's footprints all around the shelter door, smoke lifting from chimneys below, and the mountain at last sounding less like a threat than like something answered.